This has been ongoing for about a month, but only really escalated to creepy territory tonight. I was almost hesitant to share this, because I truly care about the villain of this story, but it recently became too much for me to hold in and keep to myself. I am a dietary aide at a local assisted living facility. If you're not familiar with those, they're sort of the step before nursing homes. Our residents are healthy enough to live relatively independently, and we only assist them in their daily routine. The one that I worked at really feels like the opposite of a nursing home. Rather than being cold and clinical, it's warm and feels almost like a lavish hotel. My job as a dietary aide is to assist in preparing food, serving food to the residents, cleaning the kitchen and dining room, and all that kind of stuff. Think of it as being a waiter for the same group of people every day. To give you a bit of background, I'm a 17-year-old girl who just graduated high school and is pursuing an associate's degree in pre-med at a local college, before moving away to university. I've been working at this facility for around a year now, and have grown to know pretty much all of the residents. One of these residents is Mary, who is mostly deaf and lives there with her 3 sisters. When I first started working there, Mary and I didn't really talk much or anything, beyond me bringing her drinks and taking her order. I could hardly understand anything she said, but anyway, I knew that she was lonely, due to the communication barrier between her and others. So I attempted to reach out a little bit to her. I would smile and wave and ask her how her day was. It wasn't anything I wouldn't do for my other residents, but it excited her immensely. Mary is a very touchy woman, and by that I mean she likes to touch those she's talking to, pat them, hug them. I'm autistic, and usually jump when touched, but for some reason she never made me feel uncomfortable. I took this as a good sign, and I allowed her to touch me, since I knew it was her way of showing affection, since talking wasn't really very easy for her. It started as pats on the back of the shoulder, then was hugs, then full-on embraces. And now she's at the point where she feels the need to kiss me over and over. This was the point where I become a bit uncomfortable with the contact, but only because I was afraid of how it might be perceived. I have short hair and an overall butchy and masculine appearance, and that makes many residents with memory issues believe that I am a man, and I am also openly a lesbian. One of my co-workers had to be physically separated from a resident who was romantically pursuing her, and I was afraid that my interactions with Mary could be seen as romantic or sexual. She constantly assured me that she loves me and that I'm really sweet, but she's never coming off as flirty or anything. After a few weeks of this, Mary has become persistent. When she's done eating, she stands by the kitchen door as I do dishes and simply watches me, waiting for me to come out and to speak to her. In really busy times, she's waited almost an hour for me to be free, just standing in the doorway and looking in. As I'm serving food and taking orders, she watches me. Co-workers and residents usually find it sweet or funny how she reacts, but she literally won't let me go once she has a hold of me. She's actually a really tiny woman, but she's strangely strong, and even if she wasn't, I can't exactly push one of my residents away. So I'm pretty much forced to deal with the hugs, kisses, and assurances of her love until either I or a co-worker can get it through to her that I have to go back to work. Even then, it doesn't always work out since she's half deaf. But whenever a co-worker comes to my rescue, Mary becomes strangely hostile towards them, holding me tighter and saying that she'll hold me for the rest of my life if she could. Tonight went as usual, with Mary waiting for me and attacking as soon as I stepped out of the kitchen. One of the CNAs told her that I had to get back to work, and Mary gave her the literal dirtiest look, the meanest look I had ever seen her give, and whispered to me that she'd be back later. As a co-worker and I were closing the kitchen, Mary showed up again just like she'd promised. My co-worker was getting the mop water ready in the back of the kitchen, and I had stepped out to clean the counter in the dining room when she latched onto me. "No one can bother us now," she said, and I heard it pretty clearly. She didn't like it, she continued, most likely talking about the CNA that interrupted her. Mary embraced me, kissing me over and over, and told me how much she loved me and how she would love me for the rest of her life. After about 5 minutes, I was determined to go back to work, but she just hugged me tighter. Eventually, someone was trying to get a luggage cart through the dining room, so I tried to break it off and let them through, but Mary dragged me to the other side to let them through without letting me go, and it was nearly 10 minutes before I could convince her to let me go. According to the CNAs, all Mary talks about is me, even when I'm off, and Mary knows I'm off. She waits for me, as though I might somehow show up. I truly do love and care for Mary, and often wonder what made her latch onto me. I don't know if I remind her of someone from her past, or if she just happens to really like me, but it's getting to the point where her life revolves around me, and she's willing to fight against anyone who gets in the way of that. It would be really sweet and cute if she just happened to like me, but she can't stand to be away from me. What really scares me is how she retaliates against everyone in order to be with me. My mum's theory is that Mary knows her life is coming to an end, as she's 85 to 90, somewhere in that range, and finds some sort of comfort with me. Update, June 16th, 2018. You know my theory about how Mary might think I'm a man? Yeah, turns out that was the case. One of the administrators at work told me to avoid Mary until they could talk to her about the situation. And as I did dishes tonight, we had the kitchen door closed so that Mary couldn't get to me. She started banging on the door, staring at me, when a CNA told her that she needs to leave me alone and let me do my work. Mary then said, "I want him," and the CNAs tried to explain to her that I not only was a girl but also a minor, and this just sent Mary into a frenzy, and she claimed that they were lying and that she wanted to be with her man. She started making threats, both legal and physical, and eventually it was decided that corporate would be brought in and decide if the best option would be to kick her out, since she is technically sexually harassing a minor. I was told by one of my co-workers who was helping to guard the door, and I was stunned, horrified, and a lot of other things I can't really describe. This whole time, all the kissing, touching, holding, it was all sexual. All the times she had invited me into her room, it wasn't just to hang out with me, it was because she wanted more. The woman I had thought as a sort of grandma-esque figure was romantically obsessed with me, and I can't help but feel violated. Even though she wasn't allowed to come near me, she sat by the dining room sobbing, feeling as though her only love were taken away from her. It's sort of a difficult situation, but I truly do love her, but not in the way that she loved me. I know that she's not all there in her head, and wished that I could have known this before reluctantly allowing her to kiss me on the mouth and touch me on the chest and thigh. I just thought that it was her strange way of expressing herself through touch, but it seems like I was simply too optimistic. Mary, as much as I care about you and want you to be happy, please, let's not meet. October 16th, 2018. Final update. You know how Mary would lash out at people who claimed I was a woman? Well, not long after the big incident, I decided to tell her myself, to the best of my abilities, of course, that I was not a man, and I had to repeat it tons of times, But finally she looked at me and asked, "Are you sure?" I nodded, and finally it hit her that I was a woman. Turns out, according to one of the CNAs, she had claimed that I was a man who helped her at one of the local rehabilitation centers, which explains her initial attraction to me. She thought I was someone that she knew. The next day she asked me my name, and I told her. She smiled and said, "I still like you," gave me a hug, and went on her way. Mary finally understood that I was not who she thought I was, and doesn't hold that against me. Rather, she treats me like she does a sister and the fellow residents she's friends with. Warm, but not overly attached. It also turned out that during the period with her unhealthy obsession towards me, she had a urinary tract infection, which tends to mess with the elderly's minds. I'm actually glad she put me through what she did. If she hadn't, they wouldn't have gotten her checked out and discovered the infection so soon. I know my initial reactions to everything were immature, but I genuinely didn't know how to approach the situation. I wanted to protect Mary and make her happy in her final years, but also not promote abusive sexual behavior. Finally, Mary and I can interact in a professional yet friendly way. This particular close encounter of mine occurred sometime in 2005. I was somewhere between 11 and 12 years old. My mother had just moved back to her hometown of Kooskia, Idaho, a teeny little town with a population of approximately 654. She came across a little cafe called the Idaho Backroads that had a for sale sign in the window. She wandered in and discovered the place was still owned by a friend of hers from years back. They were an older couple who were coming up on their retirement age. They were eager to sell, and soon enough my mum was the proud owner of a quaint little cafe. We spruced the place up. It had minor wear and tear those old people couldn't routinely take care of, and reopened in the summer of '05. It was a mum and pop sort of place, called the Idaho Backroads Cafe, located in a small town on the Snake River called Kooskia. Kooskia is pretty much the last stop on Highway 95 if you're heading out to Missoula, Montana. There's a smattering of tiny towns in between, but Kooskia tends to get a lot of tourism in the spring and summer months. When my mother bought the back roads, we often ran into touring elderly people, families, lone travelers, and bikers. Our food was decently priced, and to several customers, it tasted like home. Well, the cafe was our home, and we had a teeny tiny apartment in the back, in which we all lived. My older sister, Talia, lived with my mother full-time at 16. Myself and Sienna lived with her father during the school year, until our mum could find a better place to live that suited 3 girls. We were excited to work and live in our restaurant. Yes, all of us worked that little cafe, as my mother could only run the restaurant and pay bills, not hire full-time staff on the payroll. Like I said, Kooskia was a tiny town, and once tourism left, we scraped by until the next season. As a 12-year-old girl might believe, it was great waiting tables. It actually was, as at the time I was a small blonde girl with gangly limbs and a quick smile. This kept the tips flowing, as little old people find children irresistible, and were incredibly generous. I saved my tips for various things a child wants, but mainly I stashed the money away to help pay for school supplies. My mother raised us to be able to take care of ourselves, and that earning your own money for things you wanted was rewarding. Our little apartment in the back was one open room, with 2 doors on opposite walls from each other and no windows. A narrow hallway led to a laundry room of sorts, with a stackable unit of washer and dryer, 2 huge freezers, and a linen cupboard. Another section was a ridiculously small bathroom, painted a Pepto pink, if I remember correctly. Next was the storage room, with our business/family computer, Windows 98 gateway, our bigger fridge, and a sort of walk-in freezer. Then one small step away, and you were in the kitchen of our eatery. Out back was a gated pen, in which we kept our family dog during restaurant hours. Reggie was just growing out of her puppy stage, with her 2 big ears and gangly legs. She was a wolf and German shepherd mix, and was starting to grow into all the muscles of the shepherd, while maintaining the look of a wolf. She was a pretty thing, all white, save for a patch of red that ran along her back and tail. She was bought for my older sister, but being a grand majority of wolf, she regarded us all as her pack. One particular day midsummer, we were all diligently working away when a man came into the restaurant. My sister Sienna seated him in a booth and took off to grab a menu, water, and his cutlery. I was working that day as well, and something seemed a little off about this gentleman. All I remember about him is his dark, shaggy hair, his slumped posture, and more than a week's growth of uneven beard. She set his things down, politely smiled, and said she would be back in a jiff to take his order. My mother, who happened to be standing at the till, was eyeing this stranger with an unsettling intensity. My mum, in all the things she's done in her life, was a correctional officer at a prison for a number of years, and she instinctively knew how to spot trouble. She was very wary. As I walked by with an armful of dirty dishes, she squeezed my shoulder and told me to go take a break. We weren't particularly busy at the time, but it was quite odd of her to ask me to take a break so early in the day. I started to politely protest, but she squeezed my shoulder a little harder this time and looked me in the eyes with that "don't argue, child" look that you just don't argue with. So I shrugged, dropped my dishes off with Jasper, our dishwasher, hung up my apron, and went outside to check on Reggie. When I walked outside, I left the back door open, like I always do. She sat by the gate, fully at attention, with an anxious look in her eyes. I reached out to scratch her ears, which she normally loves, but today she took this almost stoically, looking past me into the apartment, like she wanted to come inside. I couldn't do that during business hours unless it was raining, and we'd put up the baby gate on the threshold of the kitchen to keep her from trotting around. I talked to her for a minute or two, and turned to go back inside. She let out a whimpering growl, and tried to hop the chain-link gate after me. I shushed her, and told her to stay put, and she reluctantly obeyed the command. Being a clever dog, she would have opened the gate herself, but since she had done this in the past, we had clipped a chain around the gate latch with a padlock, and even if she was intelligent, she didn't have thumbs to turn a key. I closed the door, and she let out a pained howl, like she needed to come with me. I didn't wish to anger my mother by letting Reggie roam free in our eatery, so I firmly closed the door and made my way outside. 15 minutes was long enough of a break, and it was nearing noon. The lunch rush was coming. As I approached the kitchen, I heard a commotion. I froze on the threshold in mid-stride. Jasper had his back to me and looked extremely tense. This was completely abnormal. He was the sort of hippie type, and was incredibly laid back. I glanced around him, and saw the man from earlier standing in the middle of the seating area, screaming at my sister. He was red-faced and completely belligerent, waving his hands threateningly, spit flying everywhere as he loomed over my 13-year-old sister. In a flash, my mum was in between them, losing her calm establishment owner look. She had replaced this look seamlessly with the angry mother bear stance. Jasper and our oldest sibling Talia joined her as well, a wall of flesh blocking Sienna from danger. I watched, terrified, in silence. Talia was an intimidating 16-year-old. She often sparred with our mother and her fellow officers for defense training practice. She also played a variety of sports, and despite her short stature, she was pure muscle. The man continued screaming, making absolutely no sense as to what he was angry about. Quickly, my mother subdued the gentleman, twisting his arm behind his back and marching him outside, pushing him across the street to the gas station parking lot. He took a swing at her when she let go of his arm, and she subdued him yet again. I was scared for this man, belligerent as he was for even attempting to hurt my mother. If she lost her temper with him, things would get deadly. She didn't mess around with threats towards her children. He waved his hands in surrender, storming off down the street. I scampered away to the apartment before she spotted me, and quickly turned on the television, pretending to still be on my break. She came in looking incredibly calm. She scanned the apartment reflexively, her danger bells still going off. "Liza, we're closing for the afternoon. Come help break down." This was a command, not from my boss, but from my mother. These were two different people. I jumped up immediately and came out. Talia and Jasper stood together, looking ashen and drawn. Sienna was just barely calmed from hysterics. This is not an easy thing for her. She doesn't have the same temperament as my mother, Talia, and I. She is a very timid individual. We turned the signs, cleaned the grills, and set up for dinner. And my mum hung a sign on the door saying out till 5 p.m. Everyone went about their jobs in silence, save for the radio playing. It was an eerie calm. Mum sat in the corner booth with my sister, whose sobs had died down to hiccups as she explained the situation. It turns out she had gone to take his order and hadn't heard something he said. She politely begged his pardon and asked if he could please repeat what he had said. He just went ballistic from there, pushing her with such force that she nearly fell, then just stood there screeching at her. We all calmed ourselves eventually, and reopened at 5 that night. Business resumed as usual until around dusk. I saw him stalking down the streets again. In this town, you can see the whole stretch of Main Street from beginning to end. I tugged on my mother's sleeve as she walked by me, and she turned to look out the window where I pointed. She stiffened as he approached the building. He didn't come in, he simply walked by, but he turned around immediately as my sister came by and looked at her. She froze and stared. His drawn, hungry face stared right at her. As he leered, he drew a filthy finger across his throat with a significant gesture at my sister. My mother wasted no time in calling the police immediately. The deputy, Carlos, responded as he knew my mother well, and they carted the man away. But since there is not a proper holding cell in the town, they had to let him go with a warning. If he came near our family or restaurant, he would be taken to jail. We didn't see him again for the remainder of business hours, and soon let it go. Things happen sometimes, and we figured he'd be gone. Night fell, and we went about our business with cleaning up and shutting down shop. At night, before we went to bed, one of us always had to take the dog on patrol, and we would walk with Reggie through the entire restaurant, opening every door so that she could look inside it. And I mean it when I say she insisted on checking out everything. We'd start in the apartment and work our way out, opening doors for her so that she could inspect. Tonight it was my turn, so I followed her as she checked under every table and booth, in the bathroom stalls, hallways, and the entire front lobby of the establishment. When she was satisfied with her inspection, she'd lay by the door to the apartment, and we'd reward her effort with a piece of deli meat, or the occasional hamburger patty if we had one left over. Then she'd pad off to the apartment and resume normal dog activity. We all went to bed around 10:30 to 11 that night. My mum and I shared a bed, while Talia had her own, and Sienna slept on the pull-out couch. During the summer, we left the doors open and latched the screen door. One on the top and one at the bottom. The top was a hook, and the bottom as a side latch. Like I said earlier, Reggie was a very clever dog and could figure out how to work things fast. So we doubled up on latches so she wouldn't go gallivanting around at night. We all quickly went to sleep, as we all generally woke up at 4:30 in the morning to start prepping for breakfast, when we opened at 5 a.m. Also, my mother was on Ambien for her sleeping issues, and she slept like a rock. Everything was fine, but I'd woken up a couple of times to Reggie letting out a hair-raising low growl of warning. I figured a cat was outside, as she did not get along well with them, so she was scaring them away from our door. I went back to sleep. What seemed to me like just minutes later, I jolt up out of bed to Reggie standing in the middle of the room, fur standing on end. I got up just as my older sister rose from her bed to inspect the problem. It was hard to see, as the back alley had no street lights and the room was dark. Talia took a step away from her bed and Reggie went ballistic. All in that same moment, as I sat watching from bed confused. She let out a snarl that chills me to this day, fangs bared. I had never seen Reggie act this way before. She was always docile and gentle. Talia calmly approaches her and whispers, "Reggie, what's the matter with you?" in a hushed voice. My mother and other sister are stirring by this time, and my mother is fighting her Ambien to wake. As soon as she says something, I hear a man curse under his breath. Shit. As if frustrated by the progress of something. Reggie no longer holds back and flies into what I could accurately describe as the scariest thing I've ever seen in my 20 years of life, and lunges full bore at the screen door. She's barking ferociously, snarling and emanating noises that sounded like someone loosened Cerberus, their hellhound, in our living space. She ripped through the screen in her rage, forcing the upper half through the mesh like it was paper. Now I heard him clearly cursing and screaming at our dog. Everyone was awake now, scrambling for lights and yelling at each other in confusion. Reg was caught by the midsection in the screen and struggled so hard to break free she knocked one of the hinges loose, I heard a snapping noise, like a bear trap on bone, and the man scream. This set our docile family pet into a frothing frenzy. She would kill him, even if she had to drag the whole door with her to get him. I heard something drop, and the man cursing as he struggled to break free from the jaws of the fierce beast that was our Reggie. My mother reached the door in slow motion, kicking it open and simultaneously cocking her pistol and taking aim. Somehow she'd managed to grab Reggie's collar and yank her back and pass her off to my sister, who dragged her into the hallway and locked the door. I heard Reggie's outraged howl come immediately after Talia locked her in, and it both frightened and comforted me at the same time. The man was gone into the black of night, and my mum closed both apartment doors, locking them. She proceeded to the front of the cafe to call the police. In the morning light, we inspected the door's damage. The man from earlier in the day had come back for his revenge, and was wielding an intimidating-looking knife. In his struggle with Reggie, he dropped it on the welcome mat. He'd been trying to jimmy the pin from the screen hinges out of the hinging mechanism, and that sound was what alerted the dog. The police canvassed the neighborhood in the early light and found a trail of blood from our back door heading a couple of blocks west until it slowly grew to nothing. Police speculated the man was in a crouching position when Reggie busted through the screen door and had probably bitten him in the shoulder or arm region. They kept a watch out for our would-be attacker, and they never found him. If we didn't have her, I'm sure we wouldn't be alive to this day. Sadly, when my sister married, she took Reggie with her to live out of town. She got out one day, and a hunter mistook her for an actual wolf and shot her illegally. She was one of the best dogs we've ever had, and I owe her my life. I only wish she would have lived a happy, full life like the one she deserved, and got to live to watch over my nieces and nephews. Rest in peace, Regina. We love you. My wife is a registered nurse, and she was on float to another unit helping out. She normally worked cardiac, but she was helping out in the Alzheimer's unit. She was saving a particular patient for last, as the patient was known to be a real pain. Very old, mean to everyone, and just generally tried to make the nurses miserable. She and the respiratory therapist got to the patient's room at the same time, and they decided to tackle her together. They got into the room, and the patient had smeared feces all over the walls of the bathroom and the hospital room. She was standing on the bed screaming and jumping up and down on the bed. The two of them somehow got the patient calmed down, got the horrible mess cleaned up, and got their jobs done. She said it took about 3 hours. They then went out and put a do not disturb sign on the door to make sure the patient could stay calm and get some sleep. They were standing one person on each side of the door, herself and the respiratory therapist, catching their breaths and proclaiming how much that sucked when they spotted someone. A big farmer-looking guy wearing a John Deere baseball cap, overalls, a red plaid checkered shirt, and big work boots coming down the hospital hallway, and he looked kind of annoyed. He walked right past them into the patient's room, slamming the door open. My wife caught the door on the backswing and marched right into the room after him, the respiratory therapist right behind her, fully planning on dragging him back and giving them a piece of their mind. When she got into the room, he wasn't there. No sign of the person she followed in. She looked under the bed, she looked in the bathroom. She checked behind all the curtains. She even made sure that the window would not open. No sign of the farmer at all. She then noticed the patient was sitting upright in bed, just kind of staring off into space. So she asked her, "Did you see anyone enter the room?" The patient said, "Yes, it was my daddy. He said he was coming to take me home tonight, and that you mean people won't be able to hurt me anymore." She responded with, "That's great. How about you get some rest before he comes and picks you up?" The patient then lay down and went to sleep, and died that night. My wife and the respiratory therapist swapped stories to make sure they weren't crazy. They both saw it. When I was a child, from 3 to 6 years old, my mother moved from Sao Paulo, a huge city in Brazil, to a small town next to the Amazon forest across the country. She was a single mom with 2 kids, my brother just being a year older than me. We were rich back then, and we looked rich as well, even though my mother didn't like to show it off, but we always had nice hair and nice skin. You know what I mean. Rich people look rich, even when they don't want to. The only asphalted street in the town was the main avenue that connected the 2 highways, and all the other streets were dirt. There were no apartment buildings there, so my mum bought a nice house for us. The house had a small front yard and a huge backyard with grass and mango and papaya trees. She worked all day. We went to school in the morning and spent the afternoon playing with the kids from the neighborhood, with a maid at home to take care of us. Mother arrived in the evening and the maid would leave. One day my mum woke up pretty late. She didn't hear the alarm clock, and neither did we. We overslept until noon, and this had never happened before. My brother always woke up pretty early by himself. Even today he still does. She woke up and realized the entire house was upside down. After waking us all up without understanding a thing, my mother went to the kitchen to make breakfast, and then she saw that all the electronics were missing. TV, stereo, even some food and her jewellery, clothes, everything was a mess. She then called her brother that lives a few houses away. Until he got there, she made us stay in our room, and she started to search the site where the house was built. They found out that someone leaked formulides into the air conditioning system. We passed out, they entered the house and stole everything they could. I was 4 years old, my brother was 5, and I remember this crystal clear. There were iron bars on the windows, and they cut the bars to enter. Now that I'm about 30-ish, I'm well aware of the horrors that they could have done to us, if they'd have chosen to. And the creepiest part is that we lived there for 2 more years. Here is a short history of how this all began. When I was about 16, my mother told me a friend of hers needed a babysitter, and I was more than willing to take the job because I could always use the extra cash. I have a very close relationship with my mother, so I had complete trust in this friend of hers, since my mother doesn't trust just anyone. So I began to babysit for her 10 and 7-year-old daughters. The oldest had a major attitude, but after I became their regular sitter, she wasn't as difficult to deal with. If you're curious as to why I'm sharing this, it's a vital detail to the story. Let's fast forward several years. I am about 19 at this point. I know this because I had graduated high school the year before, and this was a major deal in my life. So it's all very vivid in my mind. I hadn't babysat for this family for about 2 years by now. I was pretty busy after going to college, working my part-time job, and spending spare time with family and close friends. One day, my mother approaches me. and asks if I would be willing to befriend a girl that her parents felt needed socialization. She gave me a few details before I decided on what to do. She told me that the girl that she wants me to befriend was one of the girls that I used to sit for. I asked her who she was referring to because I sat for several families when I was a full-time sitter. She told me who it was, and I was slightly hesitant because of the attitude she had when I first met her, but I was always open to helping other people in any way I could. I began to get together with her every once in a while. I would invite her to small gatherings of some of my other friends, but only if there were other younger ones with us, like their little sisters or something. I was always in groups of people of various ages, usually around the age of 13 plus, and always with both guys and girls. My older friends and I were sort of the big sisters of the group, so that's why we were always happy to have those types of get-togethers. She slowly opened up to me. She began to share with me that she was dealing with depression and often felt that she was unloved by her family and friends. She also told me that she had contemplated suicide and was cutting herself. Well, the reason I took to her more than the other younger ones is because I had dealt with those same exact thoughts and feelings when I was around her age. So I wanted to do my best to give her a listening ear and a shoulder to lean on. I would give her some advice, anything that I thought would benefit her. Once she felt she could trust me, I tried to broaden her horizons, but things would slowly take a strange and eventually sinister turn. Now, when I would try and invite her to our usual get-togethers or social events, she seemed a little standoffish. I was a little surprised, but not too much, because I knew how difficult things were for her, and it did take her some time to warm up to people. Eventually, she began to try and drag me along with her when she had one of her "I don't want to be here" attitudes. For example, we would go to the house of another friend of mine. There would be maybe 6 to 8 of us in total, and we would watch movies or do something else. This was before the days of social media and the everyone has a cell phone era. She seemed to want to go, but as soon as we got to wherever it was we were, she wanted to leave. She would pull me aside and say, "I don't want to be here, let's go." Well, I at first was kind and tell her, "Come on, let's just stay for a little while, and if you still don't want to stay, we'll leave." I soon learned that she didn't want to stay even if we were all having a great time. Eventually, she kept pulling me aside whenever we were in a group setting, so I just eventually stopped inviting her altogether, because all she wanted to do was leave, no matter what the circumstances were. I mention this because it's another vital part to the story. I would spend time with her once in a while, just her and I, and she began to call me on a daily basis. It started with 2 or 3 times a day, and eventually racked up to 7 to 10 times every single day. As I said before, this time in my life I was always extremely busy, so I wasn't always home. I had my own telephone landline because I was able to pay for it myself, and I had an answering machine. Not voicemail because I was too cheap to pay for a feature I didn't need. Anyway, I would have to change the tapes way too often because of how much she would call me and leave message after message. She would leave messages like, "Where are you? Why aren't you answering my phone calls? Who are you with?" That was just a little too weird for me. Even when I told her that I wasn't always home until late in the evening or nighttime, and all she had to do was leave one message. As soon as I was home, I'd return the message that I had for the day. That didn't deter her from continuing to do this day after day. I began to get really annoyed, but stupid me didn't listen to my gut instincts. I kept telling myself, she just needs a friend. It's not her fault. Boy, would I soon learn that that was not the case. Eventually, I kind of drifted away from her for a bit. Not intentionally, just because things in life seemed to speed up, and I was even busier than before. I would have very few times that I could get together with a friend or two, possibly going out to eat, shopping at a mall, or perhaps seeing a movie. And out of nowhere, she began to show up wherever I was. And no, I didn't tell her where I was going to or who I was with. Like I said, I had pretty much drifted away from spending time with her. We lived in a pretty big suburb, so it's not like it would have been easy for her to know where to find me. I began to get really creeped out, because I thought it was way too coincidental that she was everywhere I was, and would be doing anything recreational. She even found out where I worked, and which college I was going to, something that I had never told her. She was obviously not college age, so why was she at my college campus with her mother? She wasn't even in high school yet. This isn't even the creepiest part. And oh yes, there's more to the story. When I was on break from college, I had the time to spend with family and close friends. I did get together with her a couple of times. Still not listening to the creep meter I had going off. It was so stupid. While things took an even more weird and unexplainable turn. She would ask to spend the night. And I didn't really do sleepovers anymore since I was of age and pretty much leading my own life. But she was still a young one, so I would invite her once in a while to stay over. Somehow I have no memory of how this happened, but she wouldn't leave. It's like she slept over one night and then just never left. Trust me, there was definitely not an open invitation for her to stay long term. I had told her that she couldn't stay with me because she had her own life and so did I, and she got very angry with me, and for several days refused to leave. Thankfully, I was still living at home with Mum and Dad, and they had to step in and pretty much tell her to bluntly get out. She had a little temper tantrum, but that night did end up leaving. By this time I had been fed up with her irrational and erratic behavior, and I was avoiding her like the plague. I didn't call her back. If she was somewhere I was, I would duck into hiding, so to speak, and tried to lose her in the crowd. That didn't stop her from increasing her strange behavior. Her family even did some things that I felt helped her stalk me more. Now this is not something I am making up. This actually happened. She moved to a street around the corner from where I lived. Now, that's not the scary part. Her and her family moved into a house which from her living room window she could see directly into our backyard. And from there, you could see the window to my bedroom. Yes, that happened. I only know this because I found out where she had moved, and my mother was still friends with her mother. So I remember going over there once when she wasn't coming home, and when I looked out of their living room window, I could see our house, my bedroom window, from our backyard. We had a chain link fence, so you could see everything. I got the chills when I saw that. When we got home, I informed my mum, who was so busy socializing that she didn't even notice. That's when my mother tried to talk to her mother and tell her about the situation. Her parents both just ignored my mother's warning, and my mother tried to ask them to talk to her about backing off. Well, that didn't happen. Things just escalated from there. Her mother even tried to convince me to stay friends with her, and just pretty much wanted to pawn off her daughter on me. I don't even remember what she said to try and convince me. I just remember saying to myself, "Okay, lady, you're just as nuts as your daughter." It wasn't before long that the most sinister and disturbing part happened, and this was the last straw. I was home alone one day. She was still living in the stalker house, so this had to be how she knew I was the only one home. I wasn't talking to her. I had even changed my phone number and told my friends to absolutely not give it to her, to which they respected and happily obliged. Anyway, as I said, I was home alone. It was maybe 10 a.m, and I was just getting up, ready to take a shower and start my day. As soon as I got out of the shower, I hear the doorbell ring. I think nothing of it and go to answer the door. I always look through the peephole before answering, something I still do to this day, and I see several police officers standing there. I get a sick feeling in the pit of my stomach, thinking something had happened to one of my family members. I answer the door, and they ask me, "Are you Betty?" I answered, "No, she doesn't live here." And then the officer asks, "Do you have any identification with you?" Which I answered, "Of course, but it's in the back of the house. I'll have to go get it." Now mind you, I am totally confused as to why they're at my door and why they're asking for my ID. The officer then proceeds to tell me that he has to come with me when I go to the back of the house. I just nod in agreement, but am still confused as to what's going on. So we go into my bedroom, I grab the ID, and I show the officer who I am. He just says, "Okay, thank you. May we sit down for a moment and talk to you?" I of course agreed, and motioned him back into the living room, where the other officer had joined us. We sit down, and they tell me that they received an anonymous phone call, that there was a young lady that lived at my address by the name of Betty, that was extremely suicidal and may have already taken her life. I just sat there for a moment in complete shock. I told them that she used to be a friend of mine, but that I hadn't talked to her in quite a while, and that she absolutely did not live there. They asked me if I had any contact information for where she was. Thankfully, I still had her info on hand. I then gave them her contact info, telephone number, and home address. They thanked me for my time and left. I thought that was the end of it, but not by a long shot. After they leave, I call my mother immediately, and she proceeded to tell me to come to her workplace until I had to go to classes for the day. I hightailed it out and drove to her office. Since she owned the business, it was no problem for me to stay there for a few hours. I stayed until I had to go to class, and then went on for the rest of my day, albeit shaken up a bit. The rest of the story is from a third-party perspective. All of my close friends knew about the situation by this time, because her behavior was way too psychotic for me, and I was doing whatever I needed to in order to be safe. I believe a few friends of mine and myself were at a coffee shop, one of the internet cafes from back in the day, and were talking when another mutual friend walks in and comes right up to us, looks at me and says, "I have something to tell you." I was like, "Okay, shoot." Apparently a few days before, they had run into Betty, and they said she looked eerily exactly like me. My jaw dropped and I asked, "What do you mean?" We in no way looked similar, in any way, shape or form. I mean, it wasn't like you could confuse either one of us. She had apparently begun to dress very much like me, dyed and styled her hair like mine, and wore the same kind of bracelets I would wear. I had a big thing for friendship bracelets back then, and just looked exactly like me. I was shocked to my very core. I had been on the phone with a couple of other friends of mine. I had the three-way calling feature, where you could call two people at once and all talk to one another. One of the friends on the line had informed me that they had heard about why the suicidal report incident occurred. Mind you, this was a few months after the fact. That she had heard from another reliable and trustworthy friend of ours that the reason there was a call, now this is going to blow your mind, is because Betty had called anonymously, saying that a young lady by that name lived at my house and was suicidal. That's not the craziest part. The reason she did it is because she wanted the police to think I was her. She gave the police my physical description, and this was before she started looking like me. So they would take me away to a psychiatric ward, and therefore she could take over my life. How super crazy could she be? I don't know how she thought that my family and friends would allow her to do that, but this is how mentally unstable she was. Now the timing for me was perfect, and life had taken me in that direction. My family was moving away with me for obvious reasons, so we did in fact move away. It was the best thing to ever happen to me, because she just got worse and worse over time. She began to harass my closest friends, trying to get my whereabouts, like my address, phone number, and where I had moved away to. They didn't give her my information, since they knew how psychotic she was. At one point she even began to stalk the brother of one of my very close friends, just so she could try to intimidate him to tell her where I was. He had to have his grandparents step in, because he wasn't of age yet. I have no idea what happened to that situation from there, since I had moved away, and the internet wasn't like it was today. Now let's fast forward to 2012. Mind you, this stalking began around the year 2000. Obviously, since it's 2012, social media is a big thing, and of course I had Facebook. I didn't even think of my privacy, because all of that was long behind me, and I had eventually forgotten about Betty. One day I go to sign on, and take a wild guess who tried to friend me. My heart sank for a second. There was a long pause, and the first thing I did was delete her request and block her fast. Thinking I had taken care of the eerie online encounter, but I was wrong again. She began to have her friends message me, asking why I didn't accept her request, why did I block her, and the like. I blocked each and every person that contacted me, until the messages just eventually stopped. Not quite to the end though yet. The last run-in I had with her online was when she tried to contact me through every single social media account I had. Twitter, Instagram, and I blocked her on everything, of course. She then proceeds to try and make fake accounts using my photo and name. And I thought, okay, little Miss Crazy. As you must know by now, I am more assertive and didn't take any kind of craziness from everyone. I had all the fake accounts closed by reporting them to all the social media outlets, but not before getting as much information as I could, reporting her to the proper authorities, and thankfully I had documented everything that happened in the past, and kept it all stored away. What can I say? I'm a pack rat. Once I got the reports out, the contact stopped. I also changed my name that I used on social media. Instead of using my legal name, I used an alias instead. This is the one thing she does not know about me. No one except my immediate family knows this little fact. I also put everything on super private and have set up some super high security measures. Now, one final update. On May 2016, I turn on my phone like I do every morning, and after my phone loads up it says no service. I knew there had to be a mistake as I just paid my bill to the phone company. I asked them why my phone had no service. They looked on their system and proceeded to tell me that in their notes, they received a phone call a few hours earlier that morning from a young lady. They assumed it was me, I guess, and she had just said that she had a new phone and that the number needed to be transferred to this new phone. When they told her that the name didn't match on the account, somehow, and I have no idea how, she got them to change the name on my account from my name to hers. I have no idea what she wanted to accomplish by doing this, and even worse, how the hell she got my number. I explained that this person was a long-time stalker, and that I had reports to the police, and that I have to be protected against her because she is capable of anything. So they asked me to go into their corporate office so that they could change everything back to its original state, as well as putting in some security measures on the account so that it would never happen again. Now since then, thus far, I haven't had any more incidents. I am absolutely on high alert, because if she is willing to wait 16 years and still wants to find me, for whatever reason, there's no way in hell I'll let my guard down. The only reason I didn't file a restraining order is because, as far as I know, she does not know where I live, and I want to keep it that way. However, if she thinks that I won't file one if she does find me, she's got another thing coming. So Betty, let's never meet again. I worked the overnight shift in a large medical clinic. The place was over 80 years old at the time and had been built on kind of a piecemeal. So it spreads over a few acres and has areas that would be left empty as renovations were being done. It also had research labs, offices, and medical school training areas inside. One night, I was on the 7th floor and heard a ruckus coming from below me. I headed down to the 6th floor, expecting that some construction equipment had fallen over. Now there is only one large office on the 6th floor, and it's in a big U shape. So if you walk in one door, you can only see the other half of the office. Anyway, I try the first door and it's locked. I walk to the second door and try that one. It's also locked. I get the door open and go inside. I flip the light switch and nothing happens, so I pull out my flashlight. I flip on my flashlight to see a filing cabinet with the drawers open and papers thrown about everywhere. I keep looking, and a couple of desk chairs are flipped over too. There was a computer monitor that looked like it had been slung against the wall, and the blinds had been ripped off one of the windows. As I round the U, I see a shadow out of the corner of my eye. It darts towards the first door. I had tried to open the door, and it flies open. Being young and dumb, I decided to pursue whatever went through the door. I get through the door just in time to see the fire exit door starting to close. I kicked into high gear and exploded through the door. I could hear footsteps about one flight below me. I kept chasing the footsteps as fast as I could, and even started skipping stairs. By the time I hit the fire exit at the bottom, the door is just finishing its outward arc, so I keep thinking I can still at least get a description of whoever did this. I exit the door and look to the right. It was the most logical course of travel they exited before the door was fully open. There was no sign of anything. I look to the woods across the street, and there's no one trying to climb the fence. I look to the left and see one of the cleaners sitting beside an overturned bucket, and there was a half-eaten sandwich on one side of him, and his phone on the other. I ask if he saw anyone. He said he was sitting on the bucket when the door flew open with enough force to knock him over. He was convinced I had slung open the door just to mess with him. Then I told him what happened. His response was, "That's why we don't go up there at night." I managed to convince myself it was a homeless person that got in there somehow. Every night guard I told that story to had a similar story from that office though. I also found out it had been empty for months because it was deemed unfit for occupation. They remodeled it a few months later, but the stories kept coming out about people coming in and finding their chair flipped over or their stuff moved. I still choose to believe it was a homeless person, but I never went back there after midnight. It happened in my bedroom at the age of 10. I always had trouble sleeping and spent most nights tossing and turning. I was a horror film fanatic as a child, and being scared was something I didn't have much experience with. I was not afraid of the dark, nor was I easily swayed by strange sounds or odd encounters. I did, however, know when to haul ass out of a situation or to find a trusted adult. I always slept with my closet door open, which will come to be of some significance later in the story. I should also mention that my family home was in a heavily wooded area, in what some may refer to as the middle of nowhere. One night at around 1 a.m, I awoke to a sound coming from underneath my bed. It sounded like one of my cats was scratching themselves with one of their feet, or doing something to cause a thumping beneath me. I had heard that same sound many times before, and its source had always been one of my fuzzy friends. So this time, I didn't look. I closed my eyes and tried to resume my slumber. I turned over onto my left side, which left me facing the wall against which my bed was pressed. I heard the sound again, and thinking that my kitty was directly beneath me, I said, "Good night," and I was able to fall asleep once again. The next time I awoke, it was to a surreal and shocking experience. The sheet and comforter of my bed were no longer covering me. I saw a man standing over my bed, poking me with his finger, and the way in which he did so was truly horrifying. It was not the way a child would poke a friend in jest. It was as if he was touching another human being for the first time, exploring the sensation of the tip of his index finger jabbing at flesh. What I saw was so unbelievable, so impossibly strange, that I believed I was dreaming. I tried desperately to awake from my nightmare to no avail. The poking continued. He poked at my chest, my belly, my legs and arms, paralyzed and scared shitless. I yelled, "Wake up!" And with this the man threw himself to the floor and closed his eyes, as if he was trying to lead me to believe that he was asleep or dead. I have no idea. It was at this time I realized I could not have been dreaming. I somehow found the ability to move, and I jumped from the top of my bed over the man lying on the floor and ran to my parents' room. When I got to their bedroom door, something came over me. I told myself that this was all impossible. There was no way that a person could have entered our home without breaking in, as we had always kept every door and window locked at night. I'd seen many strange things in my home whilst either falling asleep or waking up. By the third or fourth time, after speaking to my mum or dad about it, I knew it was my mind playing tricks on me. Plush toys did not have the ability to turn and whisper into each other's ear. Don't ask why. I have no explanations to offer for you. But I turned away from my parents' bedroom door and decided to hastily check the house for break-ins. What I found was nothing out of the ordinary. No broken windows or locks. No busted doors. Nothing. I assured myself that I had to have been dreaming or hallucinating, and blamed my obsession with horror for this. I made my way down the long, dark and narrow hallway to my bedroom. I peeked inside and saw no one. I turned on the light, got down on the floor just outside the doorway, and looked under the bed. Nothing. I proceeded to check both of my windows for signs of a break-in, which were not present. Both windows were closed and locked. I knew it. I was totally seeing things. I crawled back into bed and decided to just watch some TV in order to calm myself down and distracted from thoughts of the scary as hell dream/hallucination I had just witnessed. I turned on the TV, flipped to a channel with a seemingly boring program, as this always helped me become sleepy, and put the remote control by my bedside table. I was laying on my right side, facing away from the wall that I mentioned previously. As I laid there, my eyes began to adjust to the dark room, with the faint light from the TV screen. Just beyond the TV, I saw something that made my heart sink into the pit of my stomach. Inside my closet, with one of the doors now slightly closed, I saw the man standing perfectly still facing the wall, hiding, waiting for me to fall asleep. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I sat and stared at the man in my closet for what seemed like minutes, but was likely only a few seconds. I quietly got out of bed, hoping that the man wouldn't notice, and that my dad could catch him hiding in the closet. I once again made my way to my parents' bedroom door, still remaining as quiet as possible, and went inside. I shook my mum and dad at the same time, and when they awoke I just said, "Shh, don't make any sounds. There's someone in my closet." Both my parents just jumped up and said, "What?" I repeated myself and asked them to call 911. My mother immediately picked up the phone. Neither of my parents doubted my claim, as I had always been honest and forthright. They both knew there was no way that I was making this up, or that I was mistaken. I'm sure the look I must have had on my face made it clear that this was really happening. My dad told my mum and I that he was going to look, and urged us to stay in their room and lock the door. So we did. At this point I was beyond scared. I didn't know what the man was capable of, whether he had a weapon, or whether my dad was safe. I just stood in the room with my mother and cried. After what felt like hours, my dad knocked on the door and told me it was him, and that it was okay to open the door. My mum unlocked the door and let my dad inside. I said something to the effect of, "Did you get him?" And my dad looked at me with the most unsettling and confused look imaginable. "There's no one there," he said. I assured him that there was indeed a man in my room, and that he had been poking me. My dad said that he had just checked every inch of the house and found no one. He had also checked the doors and windows, just as I had done. Then it hit me. He must have a key. As soon as I said this, my parents looked at each other in absolute terror. Our nearest neighbor, a trusted and beloved friend who we considered family, was in possession of a key to our house, and she had regularly babysat me since I was a toddler. She was the only person outside of my immediate family with a key to our home. Soon after this revelation, the police arrived, took statements, checked around our property, and left. None of us got any sleep that night. The next day, my dad went to my neighbor's house and asked if she knew where her key to our house was. She said yes, and when she went to show him, she saw that the key was missing. Her home had no signs of a break-in, and she had always kept her doors and windows locked. My parents had all of the locks on our doors changed, and opted to never again give anyone a key, except in the wake of an emergency. I never discovered the identity of the man that lurked in my bedroom that night. The event left me traumatized, and it took a long time for me to accept what had happened and move on. My sleeping trouble turned into full-on insomnia, and for about a decade I was unable to sleep without a light on. It has been 20 years since that night, and apart from my parents, I have never told a soul about it until now. I've actually found that sharing this is cathartic, and I'm glad I have stumbled across these forums. My heart goes out to anyone who has suffered a trauma in their lives, and I hope that you are all able to find peace within yourselves. I work nights at a senior home. A while ago, we had a smoker that passed away, and ever since then, we have this one door that opens and closes, and we sometimes hear weird noises from it. All of this is independent, mind you. I am bipolar and can experience hallucinations sometimes, but that's not the point. One day I was at work and was watching down a hallway, and I saw something crawling on all fours. It had pointy ears, orange-tainted skin, and a bony human-like structure. It was crawling past some rooms down the hallway. I, of course, shook my head and told myself it was a hallucination. I went and grabbed a flashlight to check the rooms, because I was paranoid. As I'm checking, one man is still awake in his lazy boy, which is in front of his door. This man is also very smart and sound of mind. While I pass at the very end of the hall and hear a few bumps and don't hear anything, I go to put the man to bed, who was in the lazy boy, and literally the first thing he asks with a dead serious face, "Where did the goblin go?" My jaw dropped right there. Another freaky moment was when a lady with dementia was alive. She would get up a lot at night and her alarm would sound. We would then have to go and get her. Well, down her hallway it's always dimly lit. Her alarm did not go off, and as I look down the hall I see a silhouette of a shambling woman groaning in a torn dress. I literally shit myself, then found out it was her. I was 13 to 14 years old at the time, and living in northeast Portland, Oregon, in a small apartment, on a pretty well-known and well-travelled road. I was living with my mum, dad, and little sister at the time. My room was at the back side of the apartment, with my bedroom window facing out to the neighbour's yard. There was a fence around their backyard, and probably 8 to 10 feet between my window and that fence. At the time, I was absolutely obsessed with playing Xbox. I'd come home from school and almost immediately hop on a game with some friends. I used a Turtle Beach headset from time to time, so I couldn't hear much outside of the game I was playing. So while I'm sitting there playing something around 10 PM, probably Halo Reach, my dog Clara starts growling next to me. She was the absolute sweetest dog in the world and was also very timid, and she never growled or barked. I figured she must have heard a squirrel running along the fence, because that was often the case. However, she continued to growl and began yelping intermittently. So I go over to my window and look outside. I don't see anything at all, so even though I'm fairly spooked, I choked it up to her hearing a small animal outside or growling at nothing. About 15 minutes later, I casually look up at my window and see a man's face pressed up against it. My heart dropped into my stomach, and I screamed loudly for my dad, who promptly rushed into the room asking what was wrong. The dude took off, presumably heading towards the street, and I told my dad what I had seen. He rushes out into the living room and through the door. I go outside a minute or so later, but neither of us see any evidence of any other person outside. I was pretty shaken up and didn't get a good look at the guy because it was so dark. I didn't get to sleep that night and spent the rest of the night in my sister's room. What kind of creep watches a 14-year-old girl in her own room? Let's never meet again. I used to work in an assisted living facility. That used to be the old hospital before the new hospital was built. This facility, although very clean and one of the better assisted living facilities I have ever worked in, was old and creepy. I worked the night shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. My nights were mostly quiet, and I did a lot of cleaning and the residents' laundry. A lot of spooky things would happen there. I would usually see something out of the corner of my eye while sitting at the nurse's station. I could smell cigarette smoke from this one stairwell that led to the basement, even though they are a no-smoking campus, due to a few residents being on oxygen, and when I would go and check out the smell, no one would be there. The elevator by the nurse's desk would run by itself, and the doors would open, and no one would be in the elevator. I told the manager about it, and she would laugh and say, "Oh, you're being silly. The elevators are on a timer." However, they weren't. They would go off at the same time, and it was never on the same floors. There are 3 floors to the building. The top floor are independent care apartments, a laundry room, an open area for staff meetings or exercise for the residents. The main floor was the dining room, nurse's station and resident rooms, and the basement. The creepy, creepy basement that I hated and would not go down there by myself unless were absolutely necessary. The basement used to be the morgue when it was the hospital, and now was our pantry, medical equipment storage, and now new laundry room. We were only supposed to use the basement laundry room and leave the laundry upstairs room for the independent residents. But 95% of the time, I would use the upstairs laundry room. When I did have to go to the basement, I would literally run and grab what I needed and go back to the elevator as fast as I could. So my last Halloween working there, I was training this new girl. The new girl I had trained for 3 previous nights, and this was my last training night. I found her odd. I had never seen her around before, and that was unusual since the town we lived in was about 1,200 people, and the town we worked in was 1,400 people. You might not know everyone, but you've at least seen them around or knew someone that did. There was just something off about her. She was very quiet and mousy. She said she'd lived in the town for over 2 years, and when asking about her around town, nobody seemed to know her. Since she just started working there, she sent everyone a Facebook friend request and Snapchat. Here's the creepy part. It's 11 p.m. on October 30th, and we arrived to do pass down with the 3 to 11 people, do our rounds and check beds, and start our to-do list. We head down to the basement around midnight to switch our clothes from the washer to the dryer that the 3 to 11 people had started for us. She said she had to use the restroom in the basement, and she would be right there to help me switch out laundry. I head into the laundry room to switch out the clothes and fold the clothes that were in the dryer. I usually never did laundry in the basement, but since I was training her, I was doing everything the correct way. As I'm folding the clothes, I swear I saw her walk past me out the corner of my eye. And she said something, but I couldn't hear her over the sound of the washer and dryer. As I turn to look at her, the lights go out. Then I hear a banging noise. I'm absolutely petrified that I back myself up against the wall facing the door, and I'm fumbling to get my cell phone out of my scrub pants pocket. And I shit you not, as the lights come on, she's standing in the doorway and said, "Oh my, that was scary." I get my phone out of my pocket and look at the time. It's exactly midnight on Halloween. We finish folding the clothes as soon as we can and go to head back upstairs. We get to the elevator door and it's closed off, with the big safety door that you close when the fire alarms go off. We open it and get into the elevator and go to the main floor as soon as the doors open, and the safety door was closed on the main floor, so we have to push the button for the top floor in case that door was closed as well. I get to the top floor and the safety door was open on the top floor. I go back down to the main floor and notice the break room door was closed, even though it was always open. I tell the new girl that we should probably do bed checks again, even though we didn't have to do them for another 2 hours. All the residents were all tucked in and fast asleep. We were walking down the main hallway and the stairwell, where I smell cigarette smoke once in a while. It has a metal gate that goes across it for safety, and that was open. I closed it and locked it as we went down the hallway into the kitchen. The doors to the dining room were closed. The doors to the dining room are never closed, and they weren't closed before we went down to the basement. The rest of the night was rather uneventful. I only saw the new girl a couple more times in passing after that. I quit in December and moved, and heard the new girl only lasted a bit longer after I left, and the strange thing after that was all of her social media vanished after. I don't know if she deleted and blocked all of us who worked with her, or if she deleted all of our social media accounts, but all of the co-workers and I have asked, and no one's heard from her since. I am currently a 29-year-old female, and this took place when I was 14. I had just started 8th grade. I grew up in Southeast Texas, and as I'm sure many of you all know, fall is still very much a part of hurricane season. It was a Friday night, and it was just me and my mum at home. My dad was out of town for work. I originally had plans to go spend the night at a friend's house, but there was a tropical storm coming, and my mum decided last minute that she would rather have me home that night. I was pissed. Tropical storms weren't normally looked at too seriously. I honestly felt like she was overreacting. Of course, this was my I am 14 and therefore so grown up mentality at work. My mum did feel bad, and so we rented a bunch of movies and ordered a pizza and got a bunch of ice cream for a great night in. My parents' bedroom was on the opposite end of the house from mine. This is an important detail for later. We lived in a split-level house. The house I grew up in was built in the 1950s and was a postmodern style. Think Frank Lloyd Wright. The entire back part of the house was all floor-to-ceiling windows, about 8 to 9 feet tall. Think of just a huge wall of glass. The whole house was an open floor plan, so the kitchen was the first defined room with walls on the first floor, and my bedroom was directly off from the kitchen, while my parents' room was at the top of the stairs. This was a modern-style house, and is a bit hard to describe at times, but I hope you can visualize it. She had gone to bed at around 10 p.m. and I went into my room to watch 2 movies that I had rented for just myself. This storm was really starting to kick into high gear, and the wind was picking up, and it was raining sideways. I was in the middle of watching The New Guy, and I still remember looking at my clock. It said 12:53 a.m. I was getting tired and could feel my eyes getting heavy. With the weather so bad, I remember thinking that maybe it wasn't so bad I had to miss the sleepover. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I remember is a huge crash. It was one of the big windows in either of the dining room or living room. Our neighborhood was in a really wooded area. Then I thought that a tree or branch had fallen in the storm and had broken the window. I left my room and went out through the kitchen. Right as I was approaching the doorway from the kitchen to the dining room, I could see my mum coming down the stairs. I saw a man standing in our dining room, covered in broken glass and blood. Due to where he was standing, I couldn't get to my mum. He was young, early 20s, and was soaking wet and had no shoes on. He had literally run through our window. He was bleeding all over, had glass sticking out of him, and was standing barefoot on a bunch of broken glass. It took him a second to register both me and my mum. But when he did, he immediately launched into an explanation of how he was being chased by someone who wanted to kill him, and we needed to call the cops. My still fairly innocent 14-year-old brain didn't doubt this at all, but my mother was eyeing him suspiciously. We move into the kitchen, and my mother grabs her purse and my arm to keep me close. I had grabbed a kitchen towel to try and help his bleeding. My mum pulls out her cell phone and starts calling our neighborhood patrol. I notice this, so on our landline I call 911. We both finish our calls and are just waiting. The guy couldn't sit still, and kept getting up and looking through our kitchen windows and pacing back and forth. He didn't seem to notice that he was cut up and bleeding everywhere. He starts muttering under his breath. What happened next happened really fast, and became blurry a bit. But the doorbell rings. It was the neighborhood patrol that our mother had called. The doorbell sent the guy into a panic. He jumps up and suddenly grabbed a hold of me. He has me in a chokehold, and my mother is now screaming to please let me go. He starts looking around all frantic, and is pulling through the dining room and living room towards the stairs. At some point the bell rings again. My mum is following, still begging to let me go. He has me at the stairs, and my mum has the choice now to just go to the front door and open it, or follow him up the stairs. She runs for the door just as he pulls me up the last of the stairs. I hear our alarms start blaring. Normally we arm it at night, so you would need to type in the code before opening a door. He pulls me into my parents' room, but as soon as we get into the room, he drops me and starts to freak out. It was apparently all the lights. He starts smashing lamps, trying to get all the lights off, screaming that they're burning him. There's a small garden off my parents' bedroom, and they have garden lights that they turn on at night. He takes a chair and throws it at the glass, trying to smash it so that he can get to those lights. At least, that's what it looks like. I had crawled to a corner to get away from him at that point, when he completely turns away from me to grab another chair. I make my run for it. I run down the stairs, and the cops had made it into the house at this point, and were at the bottom of the stairs with their guns drawn. One of them grabs my arm and pulls me out of the way once I reach the bottom, and takes me outside to an ambulance and my mother. The adrenaline is coming down, and it hits me what happened, and I start shaking, and can suddenly feel pain around my throat from where he'd been holding me in a chokehold. There's a lot of yelling and screaming from inside, and maybe 10 minutes later, the cops come out with a guy in handcuffs. He sees me and tries lunging at me, which is terrifying. I had a bruised windpipe but was otherwise okay. I later learned that the guy was a 20-year-old chemistry major from one of the universities in town, together with some friends that are also chemistry students. They had made their own PCP. He had never tried PCP before and therefore had a bad reaction. They'd been driving to get some food when he first started acting paranoid and upset, and then at the drive-thru insisted they let him out and took off. Thinking you're being chased is a common hallucination to have when you start having a bad trip on PCP. Light sensitivity is also a common side effect in general for being high on it. But he wasn't a bad kid. He'd never been in trouble before and was a good student, and pretty much the last person you'd think of would do something like this. Our house was the only one on our street that wasn't completely fenced off, and that's how he was able to reach the back and those windows. When I got older, it hit me just how easy it is to become that kid. I had friends who wound up becoming chemistry majors and also DIY'd some of their own drugs. Thankfully, the night didn't end up worse, because it definitely could have gone in an entirely different direction. When I first started in healthcare, I worked at a nursing home in their memory care unit. There were 2 instances that I could think of that legitimately freaked me out while working there. One instance was when a patient was actively dying. She was elderly and on hospice at the time, so it wasn't a huge shock to us that she was doing poorly. We moved her to another place in the building so that her family could be with her without being disturbed. I was doing my rounds and noticed that her call light suddenly came on. I went into the room thinking that it must have been another resident or her roommate who could have pulled on the switch, considering that there are 2 switches in the room and it was common on that unit for other residents to wander into each other's rooms. When I get there, I noticed that there was no one there. I hadn't seen anyone go in or out of that room. There was no one in the bathroom, which was private, so no one could have gotten out of the room without going into the bedroom door. I'm shaken because it was the lady's switch which had gone off, not her roommate's. At this point, my co-worker who just got on her shift comes in to turn off the switch and sees me there. She is just as baffled as me, asking how the switch might have turned on and where the patient was anyhow. I told her where in the building she was, and I kid you not, we both heard the loudest sound of children's laughter go down the hallway. Now, I'm not sure about anyone else, but in my experience in healthcare, anytime you hear children's laughter when there aren't any children around, or someone says they saw random children just wandering around the unit, it usually means someone is about to die. My co-worker and I immediately start looking around the unit to see if there are any children. Yes, there could have been children visiting a loved one, but there were no children on the unit. After 5 minutes, we get a call from the other unit saying the lady has passed away a few minutes ago. I've always thought that it was death who turned on the light, because she wasn't where she was supposed to be. The other instance, when I was working a graveyard shift on the same unit, my co-worker and I were chilling at the nurse's station just trying to keep one another entertained while waiting for our next rounds. It was eerie quiet on the unit, since it had been several hours since the last resident went to bed. It had to be around 2 or 3 a.m. when we suddenly hear the door alarm go off and a man's voice screaming, "Somebody help me!" My co-worker and I rushed down to check who needed help and if someone had attempted to leave the unit. The doors had special locks on them and wouldn't have opened unless you unlocked them with a keycard. Seeing as me and the nurse were the only ones who had these keycards at that moment in time, it would have been impossible for anyone to leave. So while I go check the door, My co-worker went to check on the residents to make sure it wasn't one of them who'd called out. There was no one near the door, and no one in the hallways, and no one awake in bed. It couldn't have been more than a couple of seconds between the alarm going off and us reaching the area. I still can't explain it to this day. I was selling my old car, as I had brought a new one. I posted it on a couple of selling sites and Facebook. I arranged 2 visits that day and was home alone. It was broad daylight, and so I assumed everything would be fine. The first one made an offer, a little lower than I was looking for, so I said I would get back to him as I had another viewing. The guy from the Facebook pulled up in a blacked out Range Rover, and 3 other guys got out. I opened the car, explained why I was selling it, and you know when you just get a bad feeling? I wasn't sure why 4 people would come and view an 8-year-old car. He asked me if he could take the car for a drive. At this point, I was not going to get into the car with him and said, "Yeah, take it. I'll wait here with your friends." He asked me to get into the car. What if he took it? I said, well, it wouldn't matter. What's insurance for? I was not getting in the car with him. The 3 guys left and didn't speak to me, just themselves, and I couldn't understand, but they made me feel very unsure if the car would come back. The car was not worth putting up a fight for or arguing over. I was questioning my life choices when he pulled it back up. He got out and offered me the same as the other guy earlier, buying the car for his daughter. He wanted me to get into the car with him to go collect the cash, and I said I was fine and that his friends could take him if he needed to go, but that I had another viewing and would contact him later. I didn't want to walk back to my house, as I had now decided to sell it to the other guy, as they were just giving me the creeps. He then offered me more than the car was worth if I went with him now. I said no, locked the car, and started walking towards the main street, as if I'd seen my neighbor walking down, and shouted to him and his dog. They spoke to each other and drove off. I texted the other guy and told him the car was his, and that he was welcome to come any time to get it. He sort of filled out the V5 and went. That night, from my living room, the black Range Rover came back and parked outside. I live in a cul-de-sac, so I am set back to where we had been. I told my husband, and he looked and said it was strange, and then my phone started blowing up. I politely said the car had gone, and that I was sorry but I couldn't help. The car drove off, and came back 30 minutes later. It happened about 3 times that night. It was strange, but I thought nothing more of it, as the next few days nothing happened. On the Friday 4 days later, I finished work early and got back to get the dog ready to go out. We were going to head straight back to the park and run like the wind. As I get to the end of the cul-de-sac, the same car pulled up, and one of the guys jumped out and said hello. I held the lead tighter, and my dog was thoroughly unimpressed, and she gave a bit of a grumble, and he asked if he could pet her. I said no, she's a guard dog and doesn't like to be touched, and we went on to walk. He then grabbed my arm, and the dog latched into his forearm. Cue his screaming, and there was only one other guy in the car with him, and he jumped out and started shouting. This dog is the most placid and loving dog you've ever seen, and to be honest, it was a warning nip, as if she had meant to really hurt him, she would have gone through the bone. His friend was shouting and pulling him away. I called her back and got her to sit as a few neighbours came out as they went towards the car. I haven't seen the car since, but honestly, I wouldn't sell something that meant someone had to come to my home online again. So stranger who clearly wasn't interested in the car, let's not meet again. I work nights in a residential home. About a year ago, we had a woman in for respite care who liked to listen to her radio in bed, often soft-spoken talk shows and weather reports. She understandably found them soothing. While my night shifts are anything but quiet due to the unpredictable nature regarding elderly dementia patients, this particular hourly check was rather peaceful. As I turned the corner onto the corridor where the resident was, I could hear faint static with the occasional pop, crackle, and slight fragments of speech. As I got closer to her room, the static grew louder, and the eeriness was compacted by the faint squeak of a hearing aid. I was at her door, which was slightly ajar, and peered in. The only light offered was that of a late-night rerun of an old game show. The woman lay asleep in her bed, static and harsh frequencies quietly humming from her pocket radio. She mumbled along to it, and almost sounded like reverse speech. I lingered for a few seconds to see if I could tell what she was saying, but no dice. I inched closer and put a foot into the room, and the radio fell silent immediately. The program cuts to advertisements, and a door slammed at the far end of the corridor. I'm by no means a paranormal believer, but this is probably the most tense series of coincidences I've had where nothing at all actually occurred. This happened last Friday, and I'm still stumped. For reference, I'm a male in my late 20s, and live with my girlfriend who is currently away on business. I work for a large financial institution in the UK, and often work until very late, as I hate bringing work home. For some background, we bought our current house a few weeks ago, and during the move-in process, I was away with work, leaving it down to my partner and a few friends. My car has also recently had a complete electronics failure, so we were just down to using just her car. The house itself is located in a small gated community off a country road on the outskirts of an upmarket town in the UK. It's surrounded by woodlands, and if you didn't live there or know someone who did, chances are you wouldn't have heard of it, or even knew of its existence. In total, there are 8 houses in the community, and the main gate gives access to the first 6, whereas my house is located, and then a further 2 gates at the top of the road, which lead to 2 very large mansion-style houses. The houses, which haven't got individual gates, are all about 100 feet away from each other, and have enclosed rear gardens, and the neighbours are all business types, who are very often in work and keep themselves to themselves. Anyway, about 2 days after leaving for my business trip, I get a call from my girlfriend, who seems shaken and tells me that there's a man standing in the garden, and that she can't see his face, but he's walking around and crouching in the tree line. So concerned, but not 100% convinced, as she does have a vivid imagination, and it's the first time she's been home alone in our new house, I tell her to lock the doors, to go to bed, and call the police if she sees him again. I return to our city's train station on Tuesday, and agree with my girlfriend that she'll pick me up in her car. Then I'll take it home, as she's scheduled to go up to Manchester for a conference. I meet up with her, grab a coffee, see her off to her train, and then drive her car back to our house. The time is roughly 9 p.m. I park the car on the driveway, head inside, shower, watch some reruns of King of the Hill, and then head to bed. Then get woken up by a light being shone in the bedroom window from downstairs. I get up to investigate, crouching to avoid being seen, and heading up into the study next to our bedroom, and open the curtains that cover some French doors that lead to a small balcony. My heart drops when I see that a man has now moved towards the back door and is trying the handle. The house is in an L shape, so although I can't see him, he can't see me without moving around from the back door. He stops for a while, begins flashing the light on and off back in the woods, before walking calmly back into them. I call the police and make a report. Nothing happens on Wednesday, but on Thursday, when I'm giving our cat a bath, she's a sphinx, she needs them. I hear the garage door being messed with. I'm in the bathroom directly behind the garage, so I move into the kitchen to grab a knife before heading into the garage to check what's going on, when the noises stop and I hear running down the driveway and away from the house. I call the police and they send an officer around to check the property. All they find is some knife marks and scuffs on the bottom of the garage. On Friday, I get my car delivered from the dealership and decide to work from home. I also park my car in the garage, leaving my girlfriend's on the driveway. At around 11 p.m, I'm in the upstairs study listening to music and working, when I find myself freezing. I thought I was going to stop breathing as I felt someone watching me, and turning to face the French doors, I see a man, nondescript looking, around 35, wearing a coat and gloves, carrying what looked like a torch standing on my balcony. Our eyes met. Now filled with rage, I go for one of my golf clubs from my golf bag and charge towards the door. He climbs off the balcony and runs off into the woods. I've never seen this man in my life before, but I'm sure it's the man that's been causing problems recently. It also dawned on me that he would have only seen my girlfriend before and only seen her car. Maybe he thought she lived alone. I've notified the police and have bought some more security devices to install on the property as well, and parked my car on the driveway with hers. We don't know who he is or why he's doing this, but we're hoping it won't happen again. I work night shifts at a care home. Obviously, there have been a lot of deaths with the home, and I am very open/susceptible to experiencing paranormal entities. One night, I was filling in the hourly log notes in the lounge, which has a huge window, so we can see if any of the residents get up. The lights in the hallway were off, to give the residents a calm environment for sleep. The doors situated within the hall were heavy fire doors, and were often sometimes difficult to push open. I saw what looked like one of my vulnerable residents walking along the corridor. I heard the hall fire door bang, which indicated it had been pushed open and left to close on its own. And then I saw her walk back towards the direction she came from, but this time without the bang of the door, which I didn't pay much attention to. I was just concerned about her walking around the hall at 3 a.m. Her room was at the other end of a very long corridor, and her walking pace isn't very fast. Assuming she was disoriented and needing help, I quickly put my log notes down and got up to give her a hand and guide her back into bed, and ask if there was anything she needed. Although when I got up and walked out of the lounge door to look down the corridor, she wasn't there. There was no way on earth that she could have gotten back to her bedroom within the 10 seconds it took me to react. My co-worker also witnessed this, and I'm glad, because I thought I was losing my mind with the lack of sleep. I walked along the corridor using the torch on my phone for light, and entered her room. She was fast asleep, literally hadn't moved from the position I had put her in an hour previously. I then had to assume that a previous deceased resident was still here, and wandering the unit. I hope she's okay and finds peace. This happened a few years ago in high school. I was slim and pretty tall. The fight is in the spirit, and not the muscle in my case, and could probably be absolutely flattened in a fight, but will never admit that fully. One day at lunchtime, a random student, who we will call Weirdbeard, came up to me and sat down without saying much. I, being a bit of a loner, was open to the company and listened to him talk about his life. He was a massive dude, a head taller and twice as broad, and a bit neckbeardy. He spoke in a really flat, monotone voice with zero inflection. In our first conversation, he talked about how he never slept, and I offered some tips, also finding it hard to sleep. He kind of brushed it off, like he didn't actually want to solve anything or talk about it fully. He instantly moved on to the topic of self-harm and brandished his forearms, covered in some thin cuts. He pulled out a razor and was sort of like, "Yeah, that's my buddy here," waving the razor around. I take self-harm seriously and was genuinely concerned for this guy. I asked him if he had anyone to talk to about it, and from memory his response was sort of like, "Psychs are useless. They don't know anything. I don't have anyone to talk to who cares." So I felt awful for him, and would check up on him every now and again, although I barely had to try, because he'd always find me somehow and walk along me or creep up behind me. This whole thing was a slow burn, and took a long time to escalate. But alas, let's continue into stage 2. So, we hung out a few times. He found out where I was sitting at lunch, and he asked for my number. I thought, oh well, what's the worst that could happen? He started messaging me a lot. It started pretty general, but then he messaged me that he liked me. I scrunched up my nose and sent the "sorry, not interested" message that made me feel like a dick. But clearly unfazed, he continued asking me and would say things like, "I dreamt about you last night. We slept together." I often said, "I'm not looking for a relationship," but eventually moved on to saying that "you're just not my type," which caused him to ask, "Why though? What's your type?" He suggested we go shopping together, for me to choose clothing I'd like for him and a haircut I'd like for him, as if that would magically make him my type. Random, but I noticed him getting a bit experimental with his hair and shaving in some really cringe looking lightning bolts. I think he expected me to jump all over him with his new face acquisition. He started bringing up the self-harm again and again, saying that he felt that if we were in a relationship, that he'd be able to cope with his depression better. He would lash out at me and call me all kinds of horrible things for not wanting him to be happy, and would 180 from these angry rages to over-the-top apologies and the classic, "Are we good now?" At school he passed me a razor blade and said, "Keep this." I think he'd used it to cut himself and couldn't tell what he was implying, perhaps for me to do the same. It was a sort of "in case you need it" gesture. In my off classes I would study in the library, and he started to figure that out. He would walk up and just drawl, "Hey." I eventually stopped looking up, and he'd just start kicking my leg until I did. Even when I said that I was busy, he'd just say, "Geez, can I at least sit here?" I'd sort of shrug, and he'd take that as a hell yes. Once he came to me with the shops, and almost got us kicked out because the shop security saw him and didn't trust me by association. Weirdbeard laughed it off, and said that the police knew him by name, as if this was something to be proud of. He tried to walk me home a few times, and I would keep telling him that I was fine. He didn't take no for an answer, and walked me all the way to my house, even though I repeatedly asked him, "Don't you have anywhere else to go?" as a way of softly rejecting him. I went on holiday at some point and used it as a chance to tell him that I'm going to be out of reception and wouldn't be able to talk. Because whenever I usually told him I was busy, he'd just say, "Stop ignoring me, bitch. What's your problem?" sort of thing. I thought, my God, surely he'd accept this. I run into a patch of reception after one day, and I have 22 missed calls. No more needs to be said there. Just, wow, okay. Now here's when things ramp up to creepy factor. Let's call this stage 3. He follows me out of class one day and asks me where I'm going. I tell him I'm heading out for a walk around the town, and he walks after me and I say, "Oh, aren't you busy now?" He says, "Nah," and keeps walking. We're all alone at the back of the school, and part of me felt too scared and too tired to turn this giant man away. He talked about erratic fits of anger, and out of nowhere he punched a fence, causing his knuckles to bleed. I was like, "Whoa, man, you should probably see someone about that." He laughed and said that he did it all the time and not to worry, and that sometimes he just has to punch things. I laugh it off and keep walking. We walk past a family walking their dog, and Weirdbeard stiffens next to me and just stops walking. He then says after the family passes, "I killed the dog once. It was running along without its owner. Stupid owner left the leash. It jumped on me, and I stamped its spine in half." Internally, I was in shock and didn't know what to say, feeling increasingly more uncomfortable. Externally, I did the whole, "Ha, yeah, right," not wanting to show this dude that I was scared or concerned in any way. He didn't laugh. He just looked me dead in the eyes and said, "I hate dogs." Then he tells me about how he likes to kill animals when he's angry, to help him relieve the anger, and that it's the safest way for him to contain himself. I assume this means instead of hurting people. He said he'd use a stick sometimes to mix things up. I was completely alone with Weirdbeard at this point, and I turned around deciding that the walk was over. After that, I made excuses to avoid him as much as possible, and I'd get angry messages saying, "I know what you're doing. No more excuses. Stop ignoring me. At least do it with me. Just give me a chance. I would never hurt you." On my birthday, he hand makes something quite big. I say I can't accept it, and he says, "I'll teach you how to use it after class." When I still refuse, he dumps it at my feet and walks off. And now we have the finale. I message him that I wanted to end our friendship and that I was tired of him asking me out. We arranged a place to meet at school, and we met there alone. I felt like this wasn't a great idea, but people were starting to spread the word that him and I were together, and I just hated being seen with him on my shoulder at school. I met him, and he looked ready to pounce or something. The tension was tangible, and I tell him that I'm unsure about remaining friends, and he gets upset. "I'm a good guy. How can't you see that? I treat you so well. I dream about you all the time. At least let me sleep with you. At least give me that." He starts shaking. "I deserve this. You're the only person I'd ever want. If I can't have you, I don't want to be here." And he starts talking about killing himself and saying, "So that's it? You just want me to stand here and watch me die?" He's shaking a lot, and I'm not sure where this is going. I tell him that I'm dating someone else anyway, and he actually starts crying angrily. He talks about how he's been abused and how I'm emotionally abusing him and how he loves me, but I can be such a dick. This goes on for hours. He then gets quiet and gives me this death stare. I back away and say, I have to go. Please don't do anything stupid to yourself. And I leave. He sends me a text minutes later saying, I wasn't going to do anything to myself. You're lucky, actually. I was seconds away from hurting you. I could have snapped your bones. Then he calls me, breathing into the phone, finally saying that he slit his own throat, and starts shouting at me. How am I going to explain this to my parents? Look what you made me do. I'm covered in blood. He sends me multiple messages threatening to ruin my life, and makes me go through hell, as well as threatening to kill himself, and that I'd have to live with practically murdering him. Note, until this point I'd only talked with one other person about this guy, and she didn't seem worried and brushed off the topic, so I hadn't brought it up with my parents. That's when I decided to speak with my parents. We contacted the school, and we considered contracting the police or some sort of emergency service that night, because he kept messaging me about the horrible things he was apparently doing to himself. I told my parents I thought he might be bluffing, because he'd done this sort of thing before. He just hadn't ever threatened my safety before, as he was starting to do so now. Sure enough, his neck was fine, his arms were fine, and he was perfectly fine the following days. He hadn't done anything to himself, and I was glad he was okay, but angry to fully realize what a manipulative asshole he was. The closing chapter of this whole ordeal was him sending me more messages threatening to ruin my life. He walked up behind me and spat on me, whispering, "Bitch," into my ear. I blocked him on my phone. He messaged me ages later on Facebook, which we'd never talked on, to apologize for everything and say he'd changed so much. I said I was happy for him, but he still kind of asked to meet up, and for me to give him another chance, and to see how good and successful he was now. His massive paragraph was half a humble brag and half a plead. I said, yeah, no, and blocked him on every single platform. I gave this guy the benefit of the doubt for a long time, even in retrospect. I could never fully tell whether he were bluffing about things, like the violence or being cruel to animals, as he went into a lot of detail. But at the time, I saw it as a more violent fantasy of his. I felt a lot of guilt around rejecting him. He had a really messed up life, and he told me every single detail of it. So even though I never thought his actions were justified, it still made sense in some way that he'd have strange coping mechanisms and issues. My parents were really good about everything. Once they found out what was going on, they made sure I wasn't walking home alone at all, and we talked to the school about giving this dude extra psychological support with the school counselors, although I'm sure he needed more than that. It took me a long time to realize his coincidental appearances, wherever I would be, are considered a form of stalking. I'm happy to say I never got to meet this guy again, and I hope that he's sorting his issues out, and he hasn't tried to manipulate other girls. I worked in a surgery center after hours with one other employee. Tons of weird stuff had happened, but the most frightening was the following. We were in the post-op area shutting things down for the night. My co-worker comes to find me a few rooms down and asks if I just walk by the room she was in. I say no. I've been here for a few minutes. Why? She then says that she saw someone out of the corner of her eye walking by while humming and wearing scrubs, the same colour I was wearing. A few minutes later we were together and started to walk out of the post-op area after everything was shutting down and the lights were all off. We hear a strange noise, turn around, and see the main row of the hallway lights turn on. They require a switch and are not motion censored. We kind of freak out and she yells, "Okay, who's in here trying to scare us?" We then proceed to walk towards that hallway and check all the rooms in it. Nothing. So we proceed to the product reviewing area and notice that the room/hall had its lights on too. Those are motion activated, and we haven't been in there all night. Those lights turn off after 5 minutes of no motion. She goes left, and I go right towards the exit door that leads to the parking lot. In the door's window, I see the reflection of my co-worker, and also a reflection of a woman who is standing and facing the wall right next to my co-worker, literally 2 feet away from her. I freak the hell out and go sprinting back into the post-op area. She follows me screaming, asking what the hell is going on. I told her what I saw, and we got the hell out of there. I've also had a bathroom door slam shut all by itself in that post-op area, and the emergency call button be engaged, with nobody in it. A few years ago, my roommate and I lived on the 3rd floor and the back side of an apartment building. She was in the process of moving out though, so it was mostly just my dog, George Washington, and I. I knew just about every neighbor in my building, and from what I knew they were super chill. In order to understand this story, I need to explain the way my apartment was set up. In order to get to my door to enter our apartment, you would have to pass by my window, which was a very long window in my bedroom. I never had any issues, until about 2 a.m. on a Saturday. Well, technically Sunday. I heard footsteps on the walkway outside my window, and saw a shadow pass it. I usually am a groggy person when I first wake up, but ever since it had been just me, I was more aware of my surroundings, so it jolted me awake. I had a nightstick under my bed, so I grabbed it and debated about what to do for the next 30 seconds. I opened up my bedroom door quietly, right in front of our main entrance, and started to notice the handle jiggle ever so slightly. Clearly at this point, I knew I could either A, shit my pants, B, get attacked, or C, scare the person off. Choice A seemed like the most likely for my personality type, but choice C it was. I turned on the lights outside, kicked the outside door as loudly as I could, and screamed a string of words that would make a sailor blush. I heard footsteps quickly turn and walk the other way. I called my stepdad, who thankfully lived close by, and he came by to check on me and wanted me to stay with them. But I said I would be fine and he went off. The next morning I got up and got ready for church, not really thinking about the night before. I returned home shortly after and was texting on my phone as I reached to get my keys and put them into the lock of my front door. I couldn't find the keyhole though, so I looked up and noticed that my entire lock had been bashed in. It hadn't really set in what happened yet, so I opened the door and looked in. A lot of my stuff was gone. Television, computers, jewellery. They left the dog there unharmed. The irony is, I got him to be my best friend and guard dog, and he only fulfills one of those roles. My brain caught up to my surroundings, so I grabbed George and ran outside to call the police. They came out, guns drawn, as they cleared my apartment. It felt surreal to talk with forensics in your own residence. They never found out who did it, and in the end it worked out okay. A lot of the jewellery they stole was from an ex, who I had intentions of pawning anyway, and renter's insurance covered that, so I got some sweet new technology upgrades. However, I am still very unsettled internally about that night and day, particularly about that night. I replay it and often wonder what would have happened if I hadn't have woken up, or if the person hadn't easily been so turned away. It's also very unsettling to know that they were watching me, waiting for me to leave to church so that they could break in. Ever since that day, I keep my head on a swivel and pay extremely close attention to my surroundings, particularly when I get home. So to the thieving assholes who scared me and stole my stuff, let's not meet again. I am a night patrol officer at a 55 and older gated community. It's not unusual for emergency personnel to be at a condo at any hour of the day or night. Many of the residents are over 70 years old, and it's unfortunately common that a resident passes away. I've seen many things in my 5 years plus at this post, which I can't explain as normal. Firstly, the Shadow Man. While on patrol one night, I turn onto a side street, and I see what looked like someone running through the window of a townhouse. Take like 5 to 8 steps and just disappear. My headlights, as I was turning, followed the figure, so I was able to see it well. I stop, and still looking in the area that the figure was at, I grab my spotlight and light up the area. I see nothing. No footprint, no noise, nothing at all. The figure would have run through a puddle of water from the sprinklers to get away from there, and there was no splashed water or wet footprints. The figure I saw was a shadow. It looked to me like his feet and hands ended in points. It ran maybe 5 to 8 steps, turning his head, and looked at me, and then just disappeared into thin air. There was no noise, no wind, nothing flapping by the building. Nothing. Another incident I had a couple of years ago was when I had an accident at work and was out for a month. When I came back to work, I was still in pain but used a cane to walk with. It hurt a lot to walk, and I would take my time when I had to lock or unlock buildings. It would usually take me 10 minutes, but now took 20. I remember I was hurting so bad one night and got into the multi-function room, and they just had a dinner that day, so some of the tables and chairs were still put out. My foot was hurting a lot, and I decided to sit for a little bit and prop it up. I sat there for a while in semi-darkness. I was thinking to myself that when I got home I was going to soak my foot and try to relax a little bit, when all of a sudden I felt a comforting hand on my shoulder. I didn't get scared at all when it happened. It was like someone gently squeezing your shoulder as if to say, "Hey, it's gonna be okay." When it happened, I said out loud, "Okay, I'll get back to work," got up and finished the lockup. What happened later that night was the pain in my foot subsided a lot. Even the swelling went down, and I was able to unlock my buildings and not have to use the cane. I will also quite often see people walking their dogs. Now this isn't unusual at all. The community has many designated dog walking areas for residents to use. Now the dog walk area is next to a fence, and they have to cross the road to get back to the condos. But what I see a lot is someone walking a dog, and they are just past the edge of my headlight illumination. I can see them, know they're there, but can't see much detail. When I get closer, they're gone, and this happens quite often.